Hello lovely folks at YouTube, Ren here. I want to talk about this plant that I'm sitting very carefully amongst. This is Blackberry, and mine is very thorny Blackberry. So Blackberry generally falls under Rubus species, that's spelled R-U-B-U-S. There are a lot of different species of Blackberry, but they're sometimes all lumped under Rubus fruticosus. It's hard to tell like how many species there are because a lot of times there's particular phenotypes that are just expressed in a particular area that are given their own species, and we don't know whether it's actually its own species, so we just kind of lump them all under that one Rubus fruticosus species, but there may be a lot of variations in there. So blackberries do make fruit, obviously. They are aggregate fruits. I don't have a lot of fruits that are near here because the mockingbirds have been going after it really hard this year, but it does make an aggregate fruit. Most people know what a blackberry looks like. What's distinctive about blackberries versus raspberries is that the torus, which is sort of that center receptacle that the fruits actually grow on, stays with the berry in blackberries, whereas on raspberries the torus stays on the plant and you pull it and it has that little cavity in the center where the torus was. So that's one of the things that really is distinctive about blackberries versus raspberries. You can't always go by color because there are black raspberries, but the black raspberries still have that torus that stays with the plant. So in a lot of old-timey works, this plant was simply referred to as bramble. And this is the plant that is most commonly known as bramble. It is very thorny, has sort of a semi-vining habit to it. However, there are other thorny vining plants that are sometimes referred to as bramble, such as smilax, which is the greenbrier. So although usually they mean blackberry when they say bramble, not always, so be careful about that. So the wild blackberry is very, very thorny. My plants are actually wild. They were volunteers that popped up in my yard and I moved them to a better place. So they have a whole lot of thorns on them. The domesticated versions more often tend to have fewer thorns or sometimes be completely thornless. But if you have a wild plant, expect a lot of thorns. The plant itself is actually a perennial. However, the stems that we see above ground are biennial. That's the interesting thing. So the rootstock itself is perennial. It has this rootstock that sends these roots. They're actually long sort of vines that grow under the ground almost, and then the stems will pop up from that rootstock. That root is perennial. It will live for years and years and years. But the stems themselves only grow for 2 years. So the first year stems look like this. You see they're very green and they're very supple and tender, have very bright green growth on them. The first year is just about growing. They get nice and big and that's all they do. The second year, you can see I have one here in front of me. Right here. This is the one where you actually get fruit on the second year. This one little aggro. Yeah. These tend to be a little bit more woody in the second year. The leaves you can see don't look quite as green on the second year growth. After these fruit, they will die back and basically be dead. At that point you can prune them out and just leave the first year growth because this one will have fruit on it next year. You can see this one that's arching behind me is also a second year one as well, and there are some fruits on that one as well. So, pruning becomes very important because otherwise you will get completely choked out with all these dead stems. You can see I still have a few that are kind of tangled back here. These were last year's fruiting stems that I just didn't get a chance to really prune out because they're tucked way in the back there. This is a plant that is very, very hard to get rid of. It is a very aggressive spreader. Like I said, those underground roots will spread and spread and spread like crazy. I actually planted this along the fence line because I had a problem with my neighbor and it was sort of a retaliation for some of the really aggressive pruning they've done on my stuff over my property line. So I was like, oh, you really want to be aggressively pruning things? Then I'll give you something to keep you occupied. So this is my retaliatory blackberry. But yes, it is very aggressive. I have mine planted in a place that I do have to prune it out of the roses sometimes, but for the most part, the other place it grows is out into my lawn where the lawnmower keeps it in check. So that's not as bad. It is very considered to be an opportunistic plant, so it's usually one of the first things that will pop up in disturbed ground in like construction sites, edges of forests, you know, things of that nature. After wildfires is a lot of the time blackberry is one of the first things that you see popping up. This is not picky about sun. Like, I have mine in sun, kind of like a full apart sun. I have seen it growing in full shade situations on the edge of woods though. Doesn't seem to care. It doesn't care about soil either. Zones 3 to 10, that's a huge range. So this will grow just about anywhere except like really, really tropical areas for the most part. And this, of course, is most famous for a hedge plant. This was used to mark the property lines. One of the really thorny plants that was planted along the hedges that kind of mark the edges of your property boundaries. So sort of a natural fencing alternative. So it was really, really commonly grown for that reason. Obviously, the fruit is very widely known, delicious. The leaves themselves are also widely used in tea. They have a very high tannin content, so you know, they have that sort of, you know, bitter edge to it, a lot like tea. So, all right, so let's talk about some of the magical properties of this plant. So this is a plant of Venus generally, has water element commonly attributed to it. However, the presence of the thorns implies that it has some sort of Mars influence as well. And we commonly see that a lot of the Venus plants have kind of a Mars influence because Mars and Venus had a kind of a complicated relationship with each other, as we all know. So, yeah. So because of that, the Venus aspect is very widely used in healing charms. The Bramble Arch was a pretty famous healing charm. That's where the rootstock grows up into an arch and then grows back down and touches the ground again. And a lot of the time where it touches the ground, it will actually root to the ground as well. That was considered to be a very potent magical place. That archway was a doorway that if you went through that archway, usually a certain prescribed number of times, sometimes during particular magical times of the day or the year, or, you know, giving some sort of incantation in the process, it was said to cure a wide range of diseases and ailments. The leaves themselves would be taken and would be dipped in sacred water or water from a holy well, and then applied to a burn with an incantation to help draw the burn out. Some versions of the incantation are more paganish and some are more Christianized, but the incantation is pretty similar usually. And if you're interested, I'm sure you can Google it and find it. I don't remember it off the top of my head, but it's out there. Super, super widely used in abundance magic. I mean, the way that this is aggressive with the fruiting and everything, it's like abundance out the wazoo. So, and of course Venus is very big for that, you know, fertility and abundance aspect as well. This is a plant that's really widely used in Lammas or Lunasa celebrations. Most commonly the fruit is ready about that time of year, so it's sort of a natural tie-in with that season. So it's really good for like celebrating the harvest, or, you know, really any kind of celebration of bringing in abundance is good. This plant is a good use for that. Protective magic. Any plant with thorns is good for protective magic, and this is really no exception. One of the most common ways that I've seen is you go out and you actually will harvest the canes under the light of the full moon and make a wreath out of them. And then if you hang that wreath in the home, it will then protect the inhabitants of the home. Now there's some interesting folklore about dreaming of blackberries. It usually was not a good portent to have show up in your dreams. Most commonly, if you had blackberries show up in your dream, it would speak of trouble of some way. Being pricked by the blackberries in your dream was said to speak of, you know, that there are people conspiring against you in some way, or trying to hold you back and drag you down in some way. So it's an interesting little bit of folklore there if you're interested in dream magic. Now finally, of course, this is yet another plant that has a lot of connections with the Fae. The fruit of the blackberry is said to be a favorite of fairies. Some lore states that offerings of bread and butter had to be left for the when you were doing the Blackberry Arch, that you had to leave an offering of bread and butter. And bread and butter is like the favorite offering that the Fae will accept. So that really speaks of some Fae involvement there in that magical incantation. There's also a lot of folklore about harvesting after usually late September or October. September 29th or Michaelmas Day, October 11th is like Old Michaelmas Day on the old calendar, are usually the dates that are given, because of course this has been a pagan thing that was sort of constructed into Christian context. But some say that after that date, the fairies will lay claim to the berries, and if you were to harvest the berries after that time, that the bad luck would befall you. Other folklore, of course, states that the devil lays claim to the berries, usually by either stepping or spitting on them at that time. But either way, the end result is the same, and they say you shouldn't pick the berries after a particular date. End of September is a good rule of thumb. And honestly, if you find any berries after that time, they're probably not going to be good anyway, so it may be more of a, you know, logical thing that then got sort of tied up into folklore in that way. But yes, interesting little plant, of course. I mean, all plants are interesting in their own way, but this one is interesting in that, like, it's so wild, and yet we've also cultivated it to our own uses, but the wildness of it really still stays, especially if you have one of the wild plants that pops up like mine. Mine is really not friendly. It is not friendly. I get scratched like crazy every time I try to pick the berries, but I understand that. We talk, and sometimes it'll kind of let me go after a little while, but it takes a little bit before, you know, it's not to be trifled with, so. But yeah, really common plant, very easy to find. You can get the cultivated varieties at pretty much anywhere that sells live plants. A lot of the time, if you just look carefully, you can find the plants growing wild really easily. I wouldn't recommend picking it from roadsides just because you don't know what kind of exhaust from the cars is going to be on it, but if you keep your eye out, you can usually find it really readily, especially if you're looking like in May when the plants are in bloom. That's when they're easiest to spot. You can just kind of mentally mark out those places to go back for a berry harvest if you so choose. So anyway, that's all I have for you on this one. Hope this video finds you well, and I will see you again soon.